I was talking to a buddy of mine today about hips and creating torque in your hips and how your foot placement affects the amount of torque or tension or tightness you can get out of your hips in regard to like a sumo deadlift or a squat. And I thought of a pretty good analogy. Um, I learn better with analogies. I don't know if other people do, but I usually can understand things better with analogies. I was trying to explain to him that if you were to sumo deadlift with your feet facing directly forward, that is going to give you the most amount of opportunity to create the most amount of torque through your hips, through the ground up through your hips. But this is also one of the most difficult positions because most people in general don't have the hip mobility to be able to have a wide stance and have their feet straight forward. You know, one person I can think about was Chuck Vogelpool. He was able to have his feet straight forward when he squatted and deadlifted, and both were pretty wide stances. But this gives you the opportunity to create the most amount of torque possible. On the flip side, if you toe out really, really far, almost to the point where you can't even balance because you are towed out so far, you have now taken away almost all of your opportunities to create any sort of torque or force through your hips because you've already taken that range of motion out. Generally, most people have the hip mobility to have their feet towed out just almost neutral. Feet neutral, like not straight ahead, not way far out sideways, but just kind of just offset neutral a little bit. That's where most people kind of hover when it comes to their hip mobility during a deadlift or a squat. And I was trying to explain to him how if you have your feet forward, you have the most amount of opportunity to create torque and tension through your hips, and if your feet are splayed way out, the less opportunity you have to create force and torque to the ground on deadlift. And I kind of compared it to a bow and arrow. Now, if you take a bow and you put a string on it that is so loose that there isn't even any tension on that string until you get all the way to the pulled back position. Once you get pulled back all the way, that's where all the slack is out and the string is finally having some tension on it. If you were to let that go with an arrow in it, nothing would happen. Like the arrow would just fall out of your hands. I've used up all of my space to pull that bow back with no tension picking up on the string until you were all the way back. This would be an example of someone who was towed out so ridiculously far that they can't even keep their balance. They're towed out so far. And on the flip side, someone who can get in a wide stance with their feet straight forward, this would be like taking that same bow and putting a string on it that is so fucking tight you can barely get it end to end, and not one person can pull that string back aside from a small percentage of people. Let's say there's 1% of people that can actually have the strength to where they can get it started and then pull it all the way back until you're about to release it. If you can successfully get it back there without the bow snapping, the string snapping, or running out of arm strength to pull it back, you are gonna launch that fucking arrow so far, it'll be ridiculous. Now, this isn't exactly optimal because you're putting an exaggerated amount of load and strain on the apparatus, which is the bow, that is probably not meant for. So at some point you might be able to fire some shots with it that way, but at some point the string is going to snap, the bow itself is going to snap. It's just not optimal. There are going to be some materials of bow out there that can compete with that much tension and friction, i.e. Chuck Vogelpool. You know, there's always those outliers that can work in those ranges of extreme tension through your hips. Ideally, just as in bow and arrows, you want a string that is tight from the start, but not so stupid strong that you cannot pull it back all the way and then let it fire. You want to have your toes just splayed out just enough to where you are still able to root into the ground. You are still able to screw your feet into the ground. If you tried to screw your feet into the ground, if you were toed out all the way, once you start toed out all the way, if you try to screw your feet in the ground, there's no more range of motion for you to screw your feet into the ground. You already are splayed out as far as you can go. But if you take that off neutral stance, you still have a lot of room for when you go to root into the ground. You have a lot of room to where you can torque and screw your feet into the ground and build that tension in your hips. There's still room for that tension. So I just thought of that today. I thought it was a cool way of comparing how much tension you can get through your hips in regards to your stance. Obviously, the more you can toe forward, the more torque you're going to be able to create. The farther you toe out, the less torque you're going to be able to create. And this torque is what helps a lot of sumo pullers break off the ground. Sumo pullers usually the weakness in majority of sumo pullers is just getting it started, because you don't have that torque to help you get off the ground and going. Most sumo pullers, once they get the weight moving, it's no problem. The position you're in with your hammy and your glute and your hip strength, once you get it off the ground and get it in to your glutes, you're able to move through it. Conventional pullers are generally faster off the ground because there's a lot of quad movement going on there, a lot of quad dominant action going on in there. So it's actually a lot easier for a conventional person in general. There's always outliers. In general, it's easier for a conventional person to get the bar going faster off the ground, and then they generally struggle with locking out. So take that into consideration, either squatting or deadlifting. Just be mindful of how your foot placement affects your ability to get your hips tight and create torque off the ground.